Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Whenever you happenstance in this Truth Bomb riff, I am recording this on Friday morning, December 19th, 2025. And I'm joined by my colleague, my great friend from the Great White North, and I'm going to find out where he is actually at this moment soon. But Regan Boychuck, and a gentleman who I think has served these truth bombs with unbelievable information. But today is going to be a little bit different because we haven't really even, well, we very rarely prime the pump about what we're going to talk about. But this is going to have to be free flowing because I've had a chance to read some of your emails to me, or I should say, let's say messages through X. And I guess the first question I want to ask of you is, do you use X most of the time out of curiosity?
It's really the only social media I've ever logged on to. So I have yet to abandon it, but I've never been on Facebook or anything else or any of the other ones. So it's all I know. So it's just the only outlet I use of the sort.
Interesting. Interesting. So, can you give me the tone of what's happening on X on your feeds, like recently, just out of curiosity?
It's insanity. I'm massively blocked for many years ever since Musk took over, but I do get to watch the character of the algorithm, what I'm being fed. It has nothing to do with the hundreds of amazing people like yourself that I found all over the world and follow closely for the insight I'm looking for. But it's really hard to even find those people, my list of people in my own feed. And so I see the endless algorithm propaganda being fed, and it just comes in amazing waves. I'll go a week and every racist comment will be some cute Republican soccer mom, and it'll just be a torrent of the day's specialty. Just it's just mind-boggling. It's nothing of the sort. There's no access. It's no longer anything to do with the internet or the promise of social media connecting. That is completely broken, turned against us, used against us together with artificial intelligence and the sort. And so I went to journalism school 25 years ago with the crazy idea that there were journalists like yourself out there everywhere, grinding away, that they were in the big leagues. They existed. It could be done. There was people. I met them. I followed them. I accept when you go too far and find out what's actually going on, because everything you see in the media that comes too late, the best you get is, oh shucks, aren't they stupid? Or don't you feel better knowing how immoral those idiots were? They knew that was so stupid, but it doesn't prevent it, doesn't explain it. It that finding out the way the media really works has been the most difficult part. You endure under this idea that we could reach an audience, that this could change things, but when the media is part of this game, it's just a lot kick in the nuts. When the chips are all down and the hour is late, you everything you grasp for is sand. It's not really there. That was the facade, that you knew it was there, but you didn't know it was everything.
Well,
And
let
the
me tell you what
corruption you see goes global, and that's how you help me figure out what's going on here. That the corruption you found on Wall Street that was turned on Americans themselves in 2008. That's the financial imperialism of the British Empire. Those are that's where the free money comes from. Those are where the giant $1 trillion plays are made, because no one understands banking
yeah, hold
and the
on one second
corruption.
though before we go down that path because I want to comment first that where you are with that reaction was exactly perfect. And again, I had no anticipation or I wasn't leading you in that direction, at least not intentionally. But what you touched on is what I'm in the midst of. And I think it's going to set the tone brilliantly for what we have to discuss because first and foremost, I haven't been on X regularly for a long time. And the reason I haven't, I pretty much right after the election, I mean, I knew I was jammed up, through the algorithm. I would had become a marked man. I knew I was in some sort of category on X because I went from this hockey stick growth and I was seeing on these essays that I wrote because I was a blue check subscriber and there's probably obviously advantages for being able to reach audience, especially the way they wanted you to, right? So I would write these like 5,000 word essays, and they'd get like literally a 500,000 views, right? Now, at least that's what the algorithm was telling me. I would see major growth on my, let's say, follower lists, that sort of thing. And there was a lot of people that were paying attention. But then it started to wane, okay? And then it got weird. And then I got overwhelmed. Usually it goes like this in terms of the chronology. I get sex bots, like just oodles and oodles, seas of sex bots, just these pictures of these fake AI women from whatever with some silly kind of reference to something. And I immediately block, 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 try to get it off, try to get it off. But at the same time, it overwhelms you. So there's something in the algorithm that I know is associated with that. Now, I'm not a techno guy, so I don't really know exactly the details of what that means, but it's just so clear because I remember Elon had said that, in fact, he was answering questions from none other than the idiot drivel and mainstream media turned, so-called populists in a weird way, none other than Don Lemon from CNN, right? And for a short time, he worked with Elon last year before the election, and he ended up getting fired right away just because he's such a smarmy kind of, I don't know, joke to people like Elon or really anyone who pays attention. But he's just a caricature of mainstream media. But then that ended up in X, and there was this concept to like, okay, he's got an audience. Let's bring the audience share. We'll give Don Lemon access, but then he's just a tool because we know he's never going to do anything that's going to be dangerous to us, right? Because he's not smart enough to do it, by the way. But what happened with Don Lemon is he asked a simple question. He said, wait a second, what are you doing about the content moderation? That was the question at the time. And Elon said, look, we can amplify or de-amplify whoever we want to. So he just said out loud, and you can only imagine, right? There's people that are sitting behind, closed doors that are looking at all the different algorithms, and they have like categories of this, that, and the other, and they can determine who they want to. Well, especially as it relates to the propaganda, right? So like yeah, go ahead.
Well, in my case, it's explicit. So what you think and feel and what you see and you sense in those trends are a lot more explicit in a colony like Canada and Alberta. And so I'm very well known in Alberta. I'm the leading expert on some of these issues. And 5 years ago, these were major mainstream concerns to the point which the US installed another government in Alberta. In 2022, they installed a puppet outside of a general election, a party convention, installed her as an obvious quisling to America. And on January 6th, 2025, when the Canadian Prime Minister announced he was going to resign on the anniversary of Trump's insurrection, this Alberta Premier promised to double 4 million barrels a day production. So in October 2022, they installed a new government in Alberta. This Premier had tried to bribe me the year earlier, trying to offer me to get my grandpa's farm cleaned up ahead of the line to get me to be a little bit more cooperative on this thorny issue of oil field cleanup. And so I was also a candidate in the upcoming election, provincial election. And so I'm trying to make an issue out of the prospective premier trying to bribe me. But no interest in the Canadian media, no interest. And in October 2022, when this premier is being installed into the office without even a cabinet executive authority over who knows what, my X stops working. I am literally not able to tweet or do anything related to oil and gas. I
Wow.
could say hi. I could say hi to my daughter. I could do anything related to anything I'd ever published. I could not send a link to any of my work, send a quote, make a comment on everything. And I'm a major activist with a number of organizations known to every journalist. I'm showing them all. I am. And October 2022 is also when Mr. Musk completed his purchase of Twitter. And there was a dramatic change in the character of Twitter, and all the right wing crazies who had complained about the liberals, the chains were off, the Nazis were back. That was all cool. But the other side of it was activists in colonies trying to raise this issue of corporate crime and corruption, imperialism, explicit. And for a week, I couldn't until it was a done deal. Then I'm back. And nobody thinks that's interesting. Nobody thinks that that happening to in the election I ran in zero coverage. Not a single story by any journalist. The whole thing, I had two campaign volunteers. They both turned out to be saboteurs working for the current premier's party. Again, nobody in Alberta thought that was interesting or newsworthy. None of the journalists thought that they were illegally uploading voter data as we walked around neighborhoods.
Wow.
And then my and nobody's interested. And that's the sort of corruption you see on Wall Street, you see with the subprime mortgage, and these guys are untouchable.
Well,
And it's
and but the media component of it. So bear with me for just one second here, because that's a lot to unpack. But that's incredibly important because of what the zeitgeist of what we're in right now. The quashing is the story. Okay, so let me just give you an example of what my morning's like, and then I'm going to dovetail into where you came from, and then I'm going to bring it full circle because this is extraordinarily important. Okay, so first of all, this morning, Mitt Romney is what they call hot on Blue Sky, and that's trending basically, right? And he's hot because here he is, obviously, one of the most recognized members of the Republican Party, who obviously was the only guy from the Republican Party to vote for impeachment. And that won over a lot of folks, right? Okay, the guy is somewhat decent, yada, yada, yada. Meanwhile, Mitt Romney is the godfather of private equity, right? Bain Capital and Goldman Sachs has probably done more damage to the American middle class than, Donald Trump had ever done in his entire life until the fact that he's the president. That's a different story. But the way this, because of the way things are so insane, right? We had this ungodly speech, 18-minute speech from Donald Trump 2 nights ago. I don't know if you happen to watch it, but it was a stream of absolute insanity, okay? And stupidity beyond comprehension. I'll give you an example. The guy's talking about how pharmaceutical companies have been, basically all sorts of theft from the middle class, throughout its existence, and he's going to change that, and he's going to change that with Trump RX. So first of all, that's going to be like, his Liberty Financial with crypto, and he's just basically inserting himself in this, this metabolite. It's like it's a pandemic of Trump, okay, in every aspect of grift that you can possibly imagine. And then he goes on to say things like, for example, and I'm going to provide 400, and he says this in continuity. He says, I'm going to provide 400, 500, 600% decreases to your healthcare, expenditures. What? You're going to do what? It's mathematically impossible. Okay, so then he ends up saying buffoonery stuff like he ended he's the peace president, and he ended 3,000 years of conflict in Palestine and Israel, and then he also said that he's stopping all of the drug smuggling and trafficking from oceans and seas. Right? I mean, just this guy's unbelievable. It was like Stephen Miller wrote the speech, I would imagine, and then he just decided to riff on it, right, as he's doing it. And it just exposed every degree of idiocracy between the two of these fools. But at the same time, we know they have absolute control, right? So that's first and foremost. So let's set that aside for a minute. So I introduced Mitt Romney, the head of Bain Capital, trending because he's calling now for a huge increase to taxes on the rich, right? Okay, so now millions of people are online, at least on Bluetooth, or sorry, Blue Sky, sorry, on Blue Sky, and they're like, "Wow, there's a bunch of good billionaires." Okay, hey, look at what a great guy Mitt Romney is. He's kind of going slightly against the grain in Trump, so therefore they've got to be our saviors. Right? I mean, that's the gist, that's the tonality of what we're seeing trending. Now, put those two things together, right? And Roseanne and I had a truth bomb riff last night, I think it was yesterday, where I was reacting to all things Trump's speech, and I got really bombastic. I got really outrageously furious, and I started yelling at the camera because I'm like, listen, I mean, and you know how it is because we both know all of the externalities and the internal mechanisms and the whole process of, let's just call it imperialism, but it's also a corporate fascist state that is now creating fascism in this global cabal where all the freaking criminals around the world are in the same game. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like they're literally going to try to thin out the population. I think that's the goal. I think that's the goal, to destroy the United States economy. I think they're going to destroy everything. I don't know if World War III is on the other side of this, or some manifestation of something that comes to thin the herd, whether it's CDC, yada yada yada. But this is where we are in the game right now. And meanwhile, you know what all of our information is. You know where we've come from. And so in the last, I don't know, maybe half hour before I sent you this link, I'm being attacked by what tends to be, this is the pattern. It seems like they're fake female accounts. They might be female accounts, but they're hiding behind some sort of fake expression of who they are. But it seems like a lot of the time, the ones that attack me are people that would be, I bet you, getting paid. And we know that there's a lot of social media influencers that are getting paid by someone for some outcome, right? Now, a lot of what I've seen are DNC affiliated ancillaries that are basically creating echo chambers for something like this Mitt Romney, hey, there's a good Republican, or, Obama said this, or, Chuck Schumer, or I should say Hakeem Jeffries, or, somebody within the establishment, right, has got the scenario. Now, or somebody that we want to, that is, let's say, antithetical to all things Trump, right? Now, meanwhile, in this truth bomb explosion that I did, I'm like, people, pull your head out of your ass. Wake the fuck up. This is fucking insanity. What we just saw is the sky is falling. I mean, we know that the Department of Justice is absolutely corrupt. We know the FBI is absolutely corrupt. We can only imagine what's happening or going to come through the Federal Reserve. We know the Supreme Court is absolutely corrupt. We know that Donald Trump is waging war on renewable and expansion and technology. He's doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on all things, which is going to come from Alberta. And, he's going to try to rape and pillage that in the interim and everything that goes with it, right? But the point that I'm making is that what we have. And all of a sudden, I am being attacked like by the most idiotic idiots that kill the messenger, right? It's like, dude, you're a self promoter. You're somebody who's talking in ways that I can't comprehend, nor do I want to. And they're like, you're nuts. And then I'm like, what's nuts is we're in this situation and you're not listening because you have no idea what's going on. And so this paradox of people that can't listen because they're overwhelmed with nonsense or they're playing ball with nonsense, and all of the algorithms are written to amplify the liars and the confusion. And this is the result, Reagan.
I think you're absolutely right about every one of those suspicions about what's going on. And it's history that can that teaches that those are perfectly well founded. And so we're dealing with financial crisis. We're dealing with an elite attack on democracy. We're dealing with a yellow imperial press. And so it's incredibly valuable to trace that back. How many times, where have we been here before? When has this challenge arisen? And the most insightful is often the original. When did this first come up? And when you get down to it and you find the real root of all of these issues, they're staring at us right there in the history of imperialism. The British crown in the 1600s was absolute, just like everybody else. Came from God, took whatever he liked, lived large. And the first glimpse of what we associate with, what we take to be the truth, the principles that we commit ourselves to, democracy, the rule of law, the first glimpses of those that we can see looking back in history is the British Civil War in the 1640s. The levelers and the diggers, that's where we would recognize Western democracy and the foundational ideas that would put a shackle on this royalty and bring about democracy in some form. It didn't work out. It ended up in a military dictatorship under Lord Cromwell, who was puritanically religious. And it wasn't a great decade. And within 12 years, monarchy had been reestablished. And within 10 years of King Charles being back on the throne, his answer to the threat of democracy was imperialism, foreign expansion. We're going to keep this thing afloat, but we'll take it easy on the people because if we're squeezing them too far, it's going to blow up in our face. We need to go international. And so Ireland was raging by then. There was a side business of private imperialism of trying to take over all sorts of things. But in 1669, that's the root of the oil age. That's the game. Oil has always been the answer to democracy. That's the weapon, especially if it can be financialized. Its military uses, its practical uses, its financial uses are absolutely unparalleled. And in 1669, King Charles asserted he owns everything that drains into the Hudson Bay. And that's an enormous chunk of land that came to incorporate all of Canada, all of our resources. And in 1669, the king says, that's mine, and I gave it to my cousin Rupert. He's a privateer in Germany, a general in the cavalry, and the first British royalty to cross the Atlantic Ocean to go check out the Hudson Bay. And that's the king owns the oil and gas and the minerals. And that's where the wealth comes from in his sleep. That's how he's survived all this time. And Canada, that all that oil was the secret, was the the seed that led to all of this. And not too long after that, newspapers were created. And the South Sea bubble was the world's first financial bubble. A massive fraud carried out on the French, luring them into and Louis XIV in this big, expensive campaign that blew up, sank the French government into bankruptcy, ended their industrialization. They're in agriculture. That's why they got such good food. They were reduced to agriculture. And the British king unloaded all of the state debt into the South Sea Company. And so when the South Sea Company blew up as a giant financial fraud that everybody saw coming and all the big wigs made a fortune on, massive corruption played out on the public for the first time with the help of newspapers. They were created. They were the secularization of propaganda, the newspapers. They sold this financial bubble. And after it was over, we get some of our heroes that inspired the American Revolution, because after it was too late, some of the people who facilitated it the whole time told us about how bad it was and how we need to fix things up and change things. And things weren't quite reformed entirely democratically. But the first financial bubble, the first press, all of those things were related to royal intrigues, giant conspiracies related to oil in Alberta. And you can watch it through history. In 1887, the first Prime Minister of Canada wrote a private law, the Privy Council, an order in cabinet. You can still find it. It's just handwritten in 1887 on Halloween. They approved all mines and minerals forever belong to Her Majesty and her descendants and their assigns. Everything in Western Canada, west of Manitoba, all the oil, gas, everything belongs to the Queen. In 1887, in 1888, the official report to the Canadian Senate of the largest oil field in the world, Alberta's bitumen, had been surveyed over many years. They sent the official Canadian geographers to map out all the oil. In 1888, they said this is the biggest in the world. It will be a great asset to Her Majesty. And one of the questions of their investigation of the oil sands is that they said, what sort of diseases are the local Aboriginals susceptible to? And one of the answers they got was tuberculosis. And so residential schools were created, designed to spread airborne disease. And wow. So we built residential schools all across North America, tight quarters. We fed the children unpasteurized, unregulated milk so that they would get tuberculosis from the cattle, spread it airborne to each other. And when in 1920, when they surveyed their youth internment camps, they were forced to go to school there. When they did the survey, 88% of the students were infected by tuberculosis. And so by the time Alberta was created as a province in 1907, tens of thousands of Indians had already been cleared of the plains. The Queen already owned all the rights. In July 9th, 1906, there was a meeting in cigar filled rooms in London, and the Queen gave out all the land to all the oil in Alberta to her friends. They're unnamed. They're Canadian holding companies that then gave them to subsidiaries. But many years later, when the trigger was pulled on billion barrel oil fields, it was the Rockefellers who were the owners of all the oil in Alberta. And they don't pay any royalties here in Alberta. They've been stealing it since 1947. When they were finally ready for Alberta's production to come, they steal it. They don't pay anything. And that was revealed in the Alberta legislature in 1948. There was a vote of non-confidence. One of the governments that the Rockefellers had installed in Alberta fell. And a couple of days later, we had the biggest accident in Canadian oil field history. And the oil spill at Atlantic number 3 raged uncontrolled for 6 months through the entire election campaign till Albertans re-elected the government that gave away all of our oil. And then we forgot it ever happened. And so since 1947, almost all of all the oil and gas and bitumen in Alberta has been stolen. People don't know that because it's done financially. I only know that because of the con. When I learned how Wall Street actually worked, I saw what was happening here. And through the magic of borrowing money from Canadian banks, foreigners steal all of the oil with a trick of time, just like Mitt Romney. Doesn't he sound like a decent dude? Except, aren't we on the verge of a giant financial collapse? Go ahead and tax the billionaires. They ain't paying nothing for a long time. They've cashed in all their capital gains, bought all the media assets they can at the top of the bubble. You go ahead and place the tax on them. You will get nothing, just like they predicted. It's just a magic of timing. That's what all con jobs are. It's the trick of timing. And so if we play dumb like a journalist, we will deliver that plausibly. But
That was
people
brilliant,
have
yeah,
to
dude. That was brilliant. I don't want to step on you. Do you have a couple of more things? Because I want to
keep
be
going. No, no, go ahead.
okay. So, look, first of all, you described the paradigm, right? The paradigm of power. And so, yeah, you have the hierarchy, right? It's good to be the king or the queen, but then they have friends of the court, right? Which then ultimately, in this case, and we've seen throughout history of imperialism, the thing that's come to mind are like the East India trading, the East India. Help me out. East India
You
trading.
can come in, thank you.
Yeah, but Hudson Bay and all the rest of it. But it came out of the Dutch first, and then the English kind of picked up on it, and then they exported that all over the place. And I loved your dimension of how they wanted to basically, put the boot down overseas because they didn't want it to blow up in their face at home, right? And so there was that balance there. And yeah, there is that trade-off, right? Because then you get the merchants, and you get everybody, oh, this is great for business, and I can see it, and it's good for the gander, not for the goose, right? It's always that short-term sort of thing, right? And that's the idea of all of this, which is really fascinating considering the longevity of what we're talking about. But this is all playing out right now in real time. Today, specifically, and I've been saying this all over, my social media, primarily Blue Sky is what I go to above all else. I can't even do Facebook very rarely. And then, whatever. I don't want to go into too much detail there. Just to say that the whole thing is like you described at the very beginning. It is so over the top controlled. It is so over the top where you can't do what we used to think we would be able to do, connect with like-minded people. That's becoming harder and harder and harder. And so my tonality is like, I'm screaming at the audience, like, wake the fuck up. And half of them, of course, who don't know who I am, like Groundhog Day, are going to be like, you're nuts. And what I'm saying is this system is nuts, and we've got the answers that you don't realize we have. What I'm saying is it's nuts that you're reacting to what they want you to react to and not to what it is that's going to save you. And then they think I'm the guy that's selling a bag of goods. And I'm like, no, man, I'm not trying to be your savior. I'm the deliverer of the truth. When we combine our forces, we will liberate ourselves and destroy the misery of tyranny to create a renaissance of possibility. But we're right at the crossroads of everything you just described. 2025. And this is not the first time in history this has happened, of course, which is what connects us, because you know that it's going to be the people who believe in principle and liberty and justice and the law and integrity and progressive ideals and things like that that can overcome the tyranny. But going to what the moment is, so literally, the New York Times, over the course of the last, shall we say, 6 weeks, has provided more detailed information, a lot of which has been out there in the public record, but with filling in the blanks with nuances and inferences that are very powerful from the New York Times. Okay. Now, let me paint this picture really quick. So, you may or may not be aware that I interviewed and I have this relationship with David Enrich, who's the deputy investigative director of the New York Times. He's written fabulous books: The Dark Towers, the story of Deutsche Bank, Putin, and Trump. He's written Servants of the Damned, the story of tall building law firms, corporate law firms that have been playing roulette with our democracy for now decades. He wrote recently a book called Murder the Truth, which is all about the billionaire constellation of how they're able to use their influence and power to infiltrate murdering journalism. And they're challenging Sullivan versus New York Times as we speak. And New York Times, for the most part, is last man standing, even though we know that the New York Times has a lot of questionable situations as well. So here we are in this moment of Epstein, where supposedly Epstein files are supposed to be released by congressional decree, and that Trump signed off on it, yada, yada, yada. But we know all of these files are going to be redacted. But the New York Times today levied this, I'm going to say, decades long revelation of all things Trump and Epstein. Okay. And what they did and what they know they did and how they did it, and which just blows out of the water in just the most, remarkable way. All this insanity, like Trump saying, what, I didn't know who Epstein was, even though we saw pictures all over the place, or he was yesterday's news, and are we still talking about Epstein and yada, yada, yada. He and Epstein were tied at the hip for a long time, 20 plus years, right? Now, the New York Times, in addition to what I just revealed or just mentioned that they revealed, they also, the same team, about 6 weeks ago, actually did the deep dive on JP Morgan Chase, which was extremely important. Okay. Because JP Morgan Chase facilitated $1.5 billion over the course of X amount of years through this guy who was second in command at JP Morgan Chase, a guy by the name of Jess Staley, and how it worked out with the corporate boards and what Epstein was doing to facilitate that sort of relationship with JP Morgan Chase. And this all happened even after he was not just indicted, but convicted of his merchant. What was the exact charge? He was I don't want to say merchandising. He was sex trafficking to a degree, but it was the specificity of girls, underage women that were in his purview, that were in this situation at Mar-a-Lago, and then also, well, I should say mostly Jeffrey Epstein Island, or the Epstein Island in the Virgin Islands, and irony, and ultimately that that led to this like many $100 million settlement that took place. I think it was $270 million in 2022-ish, where a lot of the victims of the Epstein scenario got paid off, and they've got NDAs, so they can't really talk. But that's the whole reason, right? Rakana and Rakakis and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massey stood on the steps of the Capitol saying, let's have the Epstein files. And here we are. Okay. But the reason why I say all of that is because here we have the New York Times representing, like you said, the media conglomerate, right? Epstein and Trump, in this case, could be the king and the friends of the king and the court. Because as the Epstein story reveals, and what the audience to this particular dialogue needs to understand, is that I've since learned that Epstein is related to my story. He's the tip of the iceberg, but there's a major corollary that I'm going to jump into briefly. But that also not just parallels, but it refracts what it is that the New York Times revealed about all things financial management of the Epstein empire from people like the largest bank in the United States, which is one of the largest in the world. Okay, that's certainly problematic. But of course, the guy's connected to Leon Black, who's a major billionaire hedge funder, then Les Wexner, who is a major billionaire who was in retail, but whose family comes from all sorts of questionable, involvement with the mob over decades that led to Les Wexner's ownership of the Limited and, the women's lingerie, which name eludes me at the moment, Victoria's Secret, and all of that stuff as it related to like, getting all of these women in the pipeline from Eastern Europe to basically go through Epstein's castle in Manhattan or down in Mar-a-Lago and then Epstein Island. And they were using this, as we both know, for leverage, right? You've got all of these giant names. In fact, that's why the New York Times is, I think, doing these deep dives to basically reveal Trump's super deep involvement with Epstein, because we know Epstein was involved with intelligence. There's no question about it, right? A lot of this stuff was honeypot trafficking to leverage the most powerful people in technology and finance, et cetera. And that's why this whole thing is connected to this global elite that are above the law, i.e., the realm of kings. That's what you're talking about. And we're talking about the highest levels of institutions, academic institutions in the United States. Harvard, let this Larry Summers run roughshod, and they were deeply enmeshed in it. In fact, they've gone after two students that have gotten recordings, I think, of Larry Summers talking about it in class that they want to shut down. So they're like, trying to shut down everything right now at Harvard. This after Harvard was supposed to be the good guy, not capitulating to Trump, but it's all about the money. It always is about the money and who can control the money. And Trump as president with his goons at, the Heritage, they can control the flow to a lot of academic institutions. And that's another part of this, right? But the point is that we've got this elite, not because they're elites by any meritocracy, but because their proximity to power, and they're all leveraging each other, right? And they have absolute control. They're above the law, and everything's a sham. Now, here's the situation. You went back, let's count it, 350 plus years in your synopsis there, your brief there. I'm talking about the last 30 years, and yeah, there's a lot more, but the last 30 years incorporates what the con is, right? So here's Jeffrey Epstein, all of his connection to these giant financial apparatuses and international players, including none other than Vladimir Putin. Now, the information that I have that I've never been able to get out to the public, but that is a corollary to this whole thing, is that all of the stolen wealth of Russia from, let's call it, fossil fuel and minerals and all of their natural resources, which is substantial, just like Canada, gets extracted through the oligarchy that are under control of Putin, and they throw it into Western markets. Western markets in real estate, Western markets into stocks, all sorts of different things, which is parables to this whole thing. But why? Why do they do it? For a bunch of different reasons. And I don't want to go so deep into it because we could probably talk for hours about this. I'll just say this caveat. It appears that they were smart enough to use our ignorance and greed against us. But here's the caveat to that. They were always paid back. Why? How? Since 1987, we had Black Monday, which was a stock market crash. We had the crash of the massive tech bubble. We had what would ultimately become Enron, WorldCom. There was a lot of stuff integrated with La Cosa Nostra and all sorts of stuff. In 2019, 20, well, I think it was 2021, we saw the incredible reporting from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists who gave us the Panama Papers first, but then later the FinCEN files, which was all about the suspicious activity reports. And the FinCEN files were 2 million suspicious activity reports were not given to the Department of Justice at this time period throughout this whole thing. And what I'm telling you is the likes of Vladimir Putin, let's call it MBS, let's call it all of the guys at UAE, they're flooding money, currency, into the United States global markets, buying subprime. They're pushing it out there through the warehouse lines. They're doing the liar's loans. They're doing the honeypot trap for people looking to get into homes that they can't afford because we destroyed the middle class a long time ago. So we finance our way through it. But how? Through these liar's loans, because the entire equilibrium of a middle class economy have been extracted, right? So what happens when that whole thing falls? You and I both know what happened, but the country doesn't know what happened. We had the Federal Reserve provide tens of trillions of dollars secretly and illegally, even though it was out in front for anybody who knew where to look could find it. It wasn't that secret, but it was eyes wide shut because media didn't make a big deal out of it. And because most Americans, because of our phones and because of too much information, they don't even know the basics of how the situation works, right? And so here we are. The whole thing is falling, it's collapsing. We've given tens of trillions of dollars illegally to a predatory class that can literally go so far as to being pedophiles to protect themselves while they're getting tens of trillions of dollars to destroy the world. That's my message to people, and they don't want to hear it. How do you put all of that together, given where we were started, where you were coming from?
Well, the people you believe and the people that don't believe you know, both of you, that we're on the precipice of something big. And we've been here before. And everyone looking for an explanation outside of the con and outside of the people who understood this for 30 years and battled against it, they're not going to find an answer. We're only sold confusion, one team or the other. It's an endless back and forth game. They're both in on it. This is what they both do. And so, but there is, and that's what I'm trying to offer, what you've inspired, what you've led me to uncover is we've been here before, and there's an incredible, incredible parallel with the Epstein story today. With 50 years ago, the real moment when this all began was the end of the gold standard in August 1971. That's when this game that everybody understood was broken by the Americans. And that's what's led to the financialization we're still suffering today. So that moment, the summer of 1971, was crucial. It involved the media, it involved the banks, and it involved Alberta. Starting in 1965, the grandson of one of the imperialists that gave Alberta to the Americans, Peter Lougheed, who'd gone to Harvard, knew the score in Alberta, started a political party, and eventually won actual political independence for Alberta. He had a billionaire coal baron backing him. The Rockefellers couldn't stop him. He never said anything publicly, but he acted like an owner, enforced the law, quadrupled royalties, and built the province that I grew up in. And in August 1971, he was elected to a political dynasty. And that was the moment that the US ended the international gold standard, threw the international financial markets into disarray. Everything was new. Even Michael Hudson says that they didn't know what to expect. They didn't understand the incredible advantages they were going to get from what came. But the real story, once you know that how Alberta was involved and what was really afoot, things become more clearly because that's also the moment of Watergate. That's also the Pentagon Papers. They started to be released. The New York Times stole them from, sorry, what's his name? The New
Daniel
York Times
Ellsberg.
stole them from Daniel Ellsberg, lied to him, and in June 1971 started publishing the Pentagon Papers, which start to snowball and snowball. And what's happening in the Nixon cabinet with Kissinger, etc., is they don't like this too much. They would like to do a coup in Alberta. They would like to, but you can't. There's a lot of congressional scrutiny. The Pentagon Papers, all of the stuff is going on. They can't. And so what they do start doing on the anniversary of the Magna Carta, which on September 11th, 1217, came into effect for the first time. It's the most hated day in imperial history. It's the Magna Carta was the first shackles on royalty, the first limits to their power. They despise it like nothing else you can possibly imagine. So on September 11th, 1970, the former head of the CIA, Frank McCone, who's now in charge of a telecom company, he offered $1 million at a secret meeting with Kissinger to overthrow Allende in Chile. And then on September 11th, 1971, Mark Feltman, Deep Throat, the FBI executive, gave his first media interview. He'd had his personnel file fluffed up. He was promoted to journalist as Hoover's replacement. He was going to be the next head. And so on September 11th, he starts building towards this. And it was September 11th, 1973, that the coup was carried out in Chile on the anniversary of the Magna Carta, on the anniversary of the conspiracy with McCone and Kissinger, on the anniversary of Deep Throat, as the message of Jesus Christ, we hate the rule of law. And so after the coup in Chile, Kissinger orders an analysis of Australia, a Western democracy, but also a colony of the British and belongs to the Americans. He requests all the analysis that you would do if you're going to carry out a coup in Australia. And then Mr. Rock, the vice president becomes Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller becomes the vice president just before the pardons are given out after Watergate. So on September 5th, 1974, that's the anniversary of the assassination of Louisiana Governor, what's his name? The governor and senator from Louisiana in 1935. Uh, his name escapes me at the moment, but he stood up in the Senate in 1935 and said there was a plot against him and they wanted to kill him. And then and then 2 weeks after the government was installed in Alberta in 1935, FDR's candidate for a third term as president, his most likely candidate, was assassinated in a hail of bullets from his own bodyguards. A couple of weeks after the U.S. took control of Alberta, they assassinated the most likely challenger for a third term. And um, that happened. The pardons were given out to Watergate. Watergate was a fake scandal. Its only real result was the pardons given out to Nixon and by extension his cabinet, which included Nelson Rockefeller, who is the most likely partner in the very unusually unsolved assassination from 1935. But in the U.S. Senate, he said, they're trying to kill me.
Huey
And
Long.
on September, Huey Long. And so September 5th, 1935, 2 weeks after the Standard Oil had taken control of Alberta, Huey Long died in a hail of bullets. And then on the anniversary of that day, Gerald Ford gives out pardons to Nixon and Nelson Rockefeller on the anniversary. So that's the real use of Watergate and the Pentagon Papers. That's what was happening. It was a huge, important imperial moment where everything changed and was rearranged. The media played an incredible role. I spent my whole life lionizing that journalism, those Senate inquiries, that critique. But you know, from the internal record this far, after it was all tightly controlled by Mr. Nelson Rockefeller, the vice president. He was in charge of the commission. He said it was all going to be a hangout of just domestic stuff. And we're all done with all of our lefty journalists. So we'll tell you all about them. We're done playing that game. Things are changing up. And we're at a very similar moment today on
Can I tell you something that shocked me last night? And I don't have this verified, okay? But I'm listening to this younger journalist, a woman by the name of Ellie Leonard, who has been doing a deep dive on Substack regarding all of the emails, the 30,000 emails that the Epstein estate released, and how it ties into all of the players that are happening now in preparation for what's coming down from, obviously today with the release of the Epstein files, redacted, blah, blah, blah. But she mentioned one thing that blows my mind based on what you just said. And I don't know if this is true. Again, I don't have this verified, and I'm going to look it up after we talk here. But she said that Salzberger, I think it's Arthur, the owner of the New York Times, had offered Jeffrey Epstein a job at the New York Times about the same time he was offered a job at Bear Stearns. Now, riddle me that, bad man.
well, in from the perspective of imperialism and these characters who flatter the elite and are immune to the law, who work with banks and the media to cheat us all, it makes perfect sense. And
Does
from
it,
when
what
we say intelligence, you think imperial, and then it's all the same thing. It's all there's a
That
continuity.
that's
We go
exactly what
back
I
and forth.
thought. That's exactly what I thought. If it's true, because then it confirms what I've heard throughout the last several decades, that the CIA has deep tentacles into all mainstream media, right? Which is pretty obvious in a lot of ways. But it's like, okay, 2025. Who is the CIA working for?
Yeah, it's not the elected representatives. Even if they were representing any of the electorates, which they aren't, but it's not a mystery.
Yeah,
It's
but you
not
know that
new.
that you know who they've represented the whole time. I mean, look, and by the way, guys, this goes to my revelation. That's the most shocking of it all to me, right? So I'll just say it, so I don't have to. Look. The CIA was created out of the OSS, and by the way, the guy who was the chief of the OSS, just so you know, interestingly enough, last name is my last name. Don't know if there's any uh I don't know, like some sort of connection somewhere in the bloodline. That would be really fascinating. But yeah, he was a Lovell and he was head of the OSS, and they created the stew for the CIA and of course everything that they were doing during World War II. But the CIA eventually comes out of Sullivan and Cromwell, right? It was the Dulles brothers. They were the two heads of the Sullivan and Cromwell, which is the premier Wall Street law firm that represented so-called U.S. international interest, right? And so the CIA immediately in the Cold War becomes this bulwark supposedly against communism because it's deeply involved in anything about James Bond depictions of this throughout the 50s and the 60s. But what they were really involved with were these kind of ultra right wing groups to counter fascism, or excuse me, sorry, that was a football, to counter communism, throughout all of the theaters of the Eastern European theater and, obviously Greece and a lot of these other Mediterranean scenarios. But they would take the side of the far right, which we saw them do, of course, in Chile and Argentina and everything that you were just prefacing. And that goes into Friedman and all of those sorts of things that came out of the Chicago school, which is all the same paradigm, right? And so they were into drug smuggling, they were into the criminality, and all of this stuff would become later the way they finance black ops, as we see through the Contragate time period that includes none other than Adnan Khashoggi, the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi, who was the prominent Saudi who was all over the United States, living in Olympic Tower, but ultimately involved with a whole bunch of guys, including Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell. And he was Mossad, but he was also, it appears that he may have been a free marketeer in a way that he was playing the KGB, the CIA, and the Mossad against each other. And I think he stole $500 million from them in this. So surprised that he ended up in this mysterious, I mean, my God, do you know how fucking crazy you'd have to be to take on and try to what am I trying to say? The word's missing me, but basically sabotage, steal from the KGB, the CIA, and Mossad. That's not going to be a good outcome. But bottom line is, there's no way that Jeffrey Epstein comes out of the Dalton School, right? Whose father turns out to be, excuse me, whose headmaster turns out to be the father of none other than Bill Barr, who becomes Donald Trump's AG, but he was also assistant AG during Bush 1, who was, of course, CIA director for a long time, and they were deeply, deeply, deeply involved with Contragate. What I'm just trying to say is a shortcut. It's all the same story, okay? It's quite frankly the same story of the Opium Wars and everything, Hong Kong and the Empire and all of those things. There's always been an undergirding of the dark markets, right? That have fueled the so-called over economy. But what's the linchpin in the middle of it all? Oil, right? This is just the way the world has functioned for hundreds of years. But now we're coming to a climax of some sort. And it could either go, and this is why people need to understand the Clean New Deal, is because we've got all of the evidence of what's taken place since the housing collapse that reveals in this era how these billionaire apparatuses have got tens of trillions of dollars illegally for free that they're spending on destroying us, right? So the question that is that why I'm quashed? Is that well, yeah. So how are we going to penetrate this? It's got to be the audience out there, but I hope I'm making an effective case here. You tell me, is it too all over the map or does it make sense to you?
Everybody's offering a solution. The benefit of yours because it's correct is that it offers a way to rectify the problem. Everybody knows massive problems, but without the proper diagnosis of what's going on, can't fix it. The Clean New Deal understands what's going on, fits perfectly with not only what's happening today and tomorrow, but what got us here. It understands all of that, and it is incredibly and intimately connected. And every other story is scary. It's stupid. It involves some satanic evil somewhere. What can you do about satanic evil? The benefit of this is it's the real world. The rule of law is all we need. And stopping tens of trillions in crime is very lucrative. We'll have trouble spending the money. We're going to have to be careful to do it responsibly, but it can be solved. And to make the point of how connected all this is, in Canada, we have our own problems with politics being a colony. Not a lot of good faith allowed in the media and politics here. We have three parties. We have a more fringe left, social democratic sort of party, the New Democratic Party. It had its roots in Calgary in 1932. Elon Musk's grandfather played a key role in creating this political party in Calgary, Alberta in 1932. And they were pretended to be socialists, and eventually they became what's today the NDP party. But in 1935, when Standard Oil installed the government, the members of Elon Musk's grandfather's political party all switched teams to the right-wing, fascist, anti-Semitic, eugenic government of Alberta that ruled for another 30 some years. And Elon Musk's grandfather started another political party in Canada called Technocracy, about elites using technology to efficiently run the world. And then he came back, and when the 24-year-old premier who was installed in 1935, when Bible Bill died and he became the premier again in 1943, Elon Musk's grandfather came back to the Social Credit Party of Alberta and worked with the anti-Semitic Social Credit Party in Alberta. And the funny thing is, they stayed anti Semitic even after the Holocaust. It
Wow.
wasn't until 1949 that they finally disassociated themselves with the anti Semitism that had characterized them their whole time. And that's when Elon Musk's grandfather finally had enough of Alberta and had heard some good things about an upstart new country in South Africa that had recently imposed apartheid. So that's where he went, and later gave us Elon Musk to come back and own all the world's
Wow.
satellites and
Wow.
buy Twitter as they're reasserting control over
Yeah.
Alberta and all of its oil.
Not to
And we're
mention
back to
Peter Thiel, by the
censorship.
way. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to mention Peter Thiel because it is the ultimate James Bond, James Bond, basically thesis, right?
The technology that's behind artificial intelligence, AI, the math behind it, was discovered by the U.S. Navy in 1902. The the powerful simulation capacity that 90 years later became the basis of most science was a military secret in 1902. First used for to figure out military battles, to be able to simulate them, and to it's next level intelligence not available. And that was used for 70 years. It was classified until 1971, after the end of the gold standard. It was finally made public, and that's what's become corporate power and corporate intelligence. And what that same math has evolved to become an incredibly powerful tool of censorship. And that's what we're up against.
Deep state is what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, and it's all about the transparency, man. I shuddered a little bit when I heard you because this whole time, like my framing. It's like as a film guy, I always like to use these as metaphors. And one of my favorite films in the '90s was The Usual Suspects, where Kevin Spacey's character said the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist. And I always parlayed, Denzel Washington and Devil on a Blue Dress when he said, I got tired of them pissing on my head telling me it was rain. They must have thought I was some kind of new fool. This is just simply massive Herculean global deception with these nodes of power. And the only way to break the iron grip of tyranny, as it has always been, is enlightenment. It's just information. And what side of the force does the person serve? So, in my closing, I just say to anybody who has watched me basically yesterday erupt and just try to break the dystopia, right? The bubble. I'm trying to get inside people's heads to let them know you're being lied to. Now, the irony is they all know they're being lied to, but they don't know who I am because our work got quashed a long time ago. And they don't know that the Clean New Deal has all of these nodes of details that are all backed because it took us, of course, incredible resources. This did not come cheap. But I can guarantee you that we didn't have the resources of the federal government of the United States, who was tasked to prevent this stuff from happening, and they didn't. And this is a runaway train wreck for most of my life, okay? But I never could see the forest for the trees until I met Bill Black, till I understood control fraud, till I understood how they were able to get thousands of convictions in the SNL crisis based on the evidence and how that is supposed to manifest. And ultimately, what the corollary was to what happened in our country during the Great Depression that led to Ferdinand Pecora, who did a similar thing that would lead to the Glass-Steagall Act, the Securities and Exchange Commission. The fact is that in our academia, and this comes a lot from listening to the guys like Michael Hudson, right, who teaches about balance of power and the inside pool of the stuff that he was able to glean from his research, that then, of course, all the powers that be used against us. They found what Michael was revealing to be true, and they were like, wow, what a thought. Let's continue it and amplify it, right? I mean, Michael Hudson the whole time is like, oh, wow, I just kind of gave him the loot, but this is how it works, right? And he's been trying to tell us for now decades how it works. I picked up the ball. You've picked up the ball. Many of us are picking up the ball. And this is a global moment. And neither one of us have ever expressed real spirituality, but it's impossible not to look at the parables of the biblical prophecy and not laugh when you like it's about good and evil. It's about what we do. And maybe that's just the easy thing that people have known throughout history, because obviously mankind is flawed. But my God, man, this is real. This is now. Everything is on the line. If we don't rise to the moment with the information that we have to get millions of people to break out of their shells, to understand who did what, when, and how to fix this thing. And we don't need hundreds of millions. We need 3.5% of the population, right? If we can do that, then we can break through this dystopia. But anything short of that is going to lead to what? And I'll give you the final word.
There is no decent future. Extrapolating this model ahead, this elite control is completely unsustainable, but precarious. A facade propped up by taboo that can shatter in a moment. Once people understand enough to see clearly, you can't fool them the next day. And so, if 3.5% of concerned citizens tune in this afternoon to the new Untouchables, those are the folks with the ultimate credibility and track record of putting exactly these sort of folks behind bars by the thousands, have a clear understanding of everything going on today, all the resources in every department of what can be done at this perilous moment. You don't have to believe a roofer. You don't have to believe Patrick, but those folks cannot be denied. And if we were wrong, if Patrick was wrong, I was wrong, or any of them were wrong, it would be a lot simpler to simply argue against us, show us we're wrong, that we're fake, expose us, and that would put an end to us. Instead, we get quashed. They run scared. We keep talking, it keeps making sense. Every day's news keeps fitting this model. We're explaining how it can work. It's that censorship is the only check left. This is an explosive moment, and there's going to be enormous prices to be paid. One way or the other, there's an enormous bubble about to pop. And if we don't understand what's happening and who's doing what, we're going to bear the brunt of it, just like last time. There'll be tens of millions of people made homeless unless we see what's happening and stop it. These financial crimes have another benefit. They conjure trillions of dollars out of thin air and create these monsters. Those aren't real things. Trillions of fake wealth can be destroyed with very little consequence, taking away all their power and oxygen, helping refund those public budgets of any democratic initiative. And so it's precarious. It's based on knowledge. Everybody's capable of it. You couldn't find 3.5% of the greater public that didn't really believe in these principles. And so that's why the censorship is just next level. And for like past propaganda, no one on earth believes a word they're saying. They don't even think anyone believes. It's like it's we're at a moment, and the history does not, the environment, the climate, there's not many moments left. This is it. And I know of no one on the planet besides the new untouchables that has a clear grasp or a solution. And they're waiting for everyone to come join, listen. They'll have plenty of ideas of practical things we can do all over. Once those start multiplying, uh, there's not much that can be done about it. And getting real power in democratic hands has the potential to solve all these problems equitably, reasonably. Paying for it's not a problem. That's what the Clean New Deal offers.
I couldn't mask my appreciation for what you're saying. I was smiling the whole time because, it just emanates what it is that I always close with. We have to value truth above lies, right? We have to be able to get to a position to where the truth allows us to bulldoze the misery of tyranny to unleash the renaissance of possibility. Like you said, we have the ability to do this, but it's fleeting because they're going to destroy the system. They've got designs to destroy the system. I've known it since 9/11. I don't know why we haven't figured this out yet, other than they've gotten just, I don't know, the psychologists that help with writing these algorithms have got to be just unbelievably diabolical and horrific, right? And I could just imagine who's in Peter Thiel's world, right, with all of this scenario. But I'm just going to, give a shout out to all the people in my generation who understand, for example, what Metallica says in Justice for All, right? It's like, come on, guys, you got to find your inner headbanger here, man, because that's how we're going to break the wall of dystopia. When you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in liberty, decency, dignity, sustainability, beauty, possibility, equality, opportunity, when we merge in unity behind the Clean New Deal, we will bulldoze the misery of tyranny to release the renaissance of possibility, because you have to become a nuclear reaction to the Big Bang of truth. And that's the way it works in the universe, man, when we force light into darkness. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been fun. We'll talk soon, man. All the best.
Take care.